All right, everybody, welcome. I told you we're going to do something a little different today, and indeed we are. I'm actually out in Seattle, Washington for the College Broadcasters Inc. National Conference, the Student Electronic Media Conference. So, with that, I'm going to deliver today's lecture through this delivery method. And then for the last part of class, you're going to be able to get into your groups and work on your major projects. And those major projects are going to come up pretty quickly. So you want to use them wisely. And you're to be working through 2:45. Don't be leaving thinking this is free time. This is time to work. Well, let's get going and talk about what we had started last class and the Electronic and Visual Sport Communication, Chapter 8. And the last thing we were talking about was all sports radio. And so this was the last slide we were looking at. And sports radio, as we said, is really growing. It's a main target for young males, so advertisers like to reach that audience. It's hard to reach them. There's nearly 700 stations in America, which is more than doubled in the last 10 years as the sports radio market has grown drastically. The revenue for sports radio is $700 million. Now, radio as a whole brings in about $15 billion. So about 1/18 of the revenue comes from all sports radio. The top billing station in America is WFAN. It brings in $40 million a year. And think of all the sports that is going on in the New York market. New York, the largest city in America, the number one rated market. The Mets, the Nets, the Giants, the Devils, and WFAN has a connection with all of them. Here in Evansville, we have two all-sport stations, 105.3 FM. They are the ESPN station. A few months back, it was actually 106.7, a station out of Mount Vernon, Indiana, that carried ESPN, but 105.3 is a much better signal, and ESPN wanted to get connected with them. And then there's also 101.9 Fox Sports Radio. That's a station that's actually licensed out of Owensboro, but they very much target the Evansville market. Looking at some other aspects of sports radio, what about the jobs that there are? And what about the listenership that there is? We're going to look at some of those areas. How about the largest audience that sports radio tends to get? And that was the Super Bowl. This last Super Bowl, the radio audience was 10 million people. Now, TV had about 111 million viewers, but 10 million listeners to radio, that is an absolutely huge number, and so sports radio is still incredibly viable. The target for sports radio, there's different levels of fans, those who are somewhat interested, those who are kind of interested, and those who are very, very interested in avid sports fans. That's what sports radio is going after, is that avid sports fan, the one who's going to listen religiously and often. And so why is that a good thing? Well, for the advertisers, especially on radio, you get people to pay attention to your ads or commercials by hearing them over and over. Just hearing a commercial once usually won't do a lot, but if that avid sports fan comes back and listens often, they're going to hear those commercials often. They're going to become more likely to buy or use the service that's being presented. There have been some female hosts on the national sports talk area, and the first one ever was Nancy Donnellan. And she started in a local market, in a little bit of a bigger market than Evansville, eventually got on with ESPN and was on for several years, and actually really enjoyed listening to her. She had a really interesting style, great guests, knew how to move a program along. Without a doubt, sports radio, sports talk radio especially, is a male-dominated sport, but there are opportunities for females when it comes to that. Then there's also the game broadcast, and so we have the sports talk radio, but there's also the play-by-play of radio, and there's a lot of opportunities there. What we're going to look at here is
I need proof
what
of
goes
insurance. That's my
into,
guy.
I'll turn that off for a second, what goes into just preparing for a sports play-by-play broadcast. The typical thought is for just the beginner on the local level, if you're doing 3 hours of football, you should be doing 9 hours of prep.
Describe your weekly prep for a Saturday college football game.
Yeah, Mondays I usually go through each media guide, and after plugging in the depth chart into my boards, I go too deep on my boards for both teams, get the sizes and the hometowns and the classes and everything plugged in there. So get that basic skeleton plugged in, then go through the media guide, and before we get into any kind of conference calls or anything, I try to have a note or two from the media guide about each guy in the two deep. So that's 44 guys for each team, with the 22 on offense and the 22 on defense, whether that's, made 12 starts as a freshman last year or making first career start today. Just something simple like that. And from there, going into what is usually a conference call with a visiting team on Wednesday, from those notes that you get by looking through the media guides and looking through game notes early in the week, you can develop some questions to be able to talk to the coaches and you get some more detailed stuff. I think it's important during those coaches' calls and conversations to have an idea where you want to take the conversation, what kind of stuff you're looking to get. I think a good question to ask is to just, Coach, I see a stat sheet, I see a roster. Tell me a thing or two that I can't see on there about player A or player B. And some coaches are better than others at getting you stuff. But from there on Wednesday, we talk with the visiting team. Thursday, go over a lot of little things that you got to add into your board, and as far as special teams and notes about the stadium and the schools. Travel Friday morning for a Saturday game. Usually Friday afternoon, you meet with the home coaches, maybe go to a practice, dinner, and a production meeting with a crew on Friday night. And Saturday, you like to be able to be kind of finished up with your prep and maybe just go over highlighting and jotting in a few extra notes in your boards. But you should pretty much be ready to go Friday night for that Saturday game. But it's definitely a process through the week that takes a while to get into a routine where you're comfortable, and it's an ever-evolving process too, where you find stuff that works and that might change over the course of time.
So there you get a feeling for all of what goes into a sports broadcast, and there's a whole lot more that goes into that as well. Well, if you're interested in working in sports radio, what kind of jobs are there out there? There's, of course, management and administrative, especially the management jobs. Those tend to come later in a career. Some of the most recognizable ones, the anchor host. You're the host or anchor for the ESPN, name whatever show that you want that ESPN Radio has. Or perhaps you do some local radio sports, and both of the stations that I've talked about have some local sports as well. There's the play-by-play, the person who's calling the game on radio, and then they'd have a color person. Then there'd be others supporting them as well, perhaps a sideline reporter. Then there's just a general reporter or even the sideline reporter. And then there's the job of the producer. When it comes to sports radio, a producer, let's say it's for ESPN, for their sports talk. The producer is a person who helps set up the interviews, make sure that there's people ready to call. We need to talk to somebody from the NFL. They set those kinds of things up. They establish what the program is going to be along with the talent, and then they do that stuff. If they're a producer for a play-by-play broadcast, they're the one who's back there running all the equipment. They're the ones who are cueing the announcer to make sure that they read, let's say it's a field goal and it's the all-state good hands or whatever. They're reminding the play-by-play person to say those things that have been paid for. Now let's switch over to TV, and especially broadcast TV, but we'll be looking at cable in just a minute. TV, of all the different kinds of electronic media, is the most powerful and the most significant. It's where the most money comes from, and when you have the most money and you're paying the most for it, you're going to have a lot of power in what is said and what is done. Now, the book does get into a portion about the history. Make sure you read that. There's going to be some questions on the test about the history. But some of the big one really was the 1939. It was the first televised sporting event. It was college baseball. And it was actually a really bad broadcast because they had one camera. It was from what we would see, a really poor quality camera. It's baseball. The action's far away. You could hardly see the baseball. You could hardly see the players because you were going with a wide shot. But it was the first broadcast, and it really moved things along. Eventually, some of the big things and really good for early TV were boxing and basketball because they were indoors. You could control the climate. And then they also, especially boxing, had bright lights, and cameras at that time needed bright lights just to be able to see what they were looking at. And then today, we've gotten to where there's major TV contracts, and the contracts are in the millions, the hundreds of millions, and even the billions of dollars a year, and that has driven sports to be what it is today. Within TV, of course, one of the leaders in there is ESPN. And ESPN is the sports leader today, and they really took up the mantle of ABC. ABC was the sports leader. They're the wide world of sports. We watched a little bit of that early in the semester. Then Disney, which owns ABC, eventually bought out ESPN, and so ESPN has just absorbed a lot of what ABC used to be. So ESPN, it has really changed sports reporting on all levels, even local. Just think about the way some ESPN announcers announce, some of the sayings and the energy they put in. That's come down to the local level in many ways. But then on the other side, ESPN, they're out doing lots of stories about lots of national teams. So if I want to know what's going on a national level, I'm going to ESPN. That has forced local TV to go cover more local sports. And before ESPN, if you wanted to know national stuff, you would actually watch your local sports for it. You'd see the headlines there, the highlights. But now that ESPN is where you go. Local TV has had to respond. The biggest event on TV, especially broadcast TV, is the Super Bowl. We know that every year, pretty much an unofficial American holiday. How big has the Super Bowl gotten? Well, it's gotten absolutely huge. You want to buy a commercial for the Super Bowl? This upcoming Super Bowl, if you want to buy a 30-second TV commercial, it's going to cost right around $4 million. And there really are no other TV shows that come close to being able to ask for a $4 million per commercial charge. Now, not every commercial in the Super Bowl is going to cost $4 million. The ones closest to the kickoff are going to cost a little bit more than some, say, in the second half, depending where in the second half. Right around the kickoff, often, especially if it's a bad ball game like last year, you're not going to have as much of an audience late in the game as you would early in the game. This last year, what kind of audience did the Super Bowl have? 111 million viewers. And the last 2 years for the Super Bowl, each year, has been the most people that have ever watched an individual show or program on TV. So it has more viewers of any TV program. Now, what's interesting is when you look at TV, you have something called ratings, and you've heard about it all sorts of times. A certain show has some kind of rating. All a rating is basically a percentage of people or a percentage of households that watch a TV show out of all the households in America. So what kind of ratings do the Super Bowl have? Well, the highest rated program ever is not the Super Bowl. Super Bowls usually get about a 42 to 43 rating, meaning 42% of American households are watching the Super Bowl. The highest rated program ever came in at a 60 rating, and it is MASH. It was a comedy show from the late 70s and the early 80s. And looking at these numbers over here, the percentage of households, 60% of all households were watching MASH. And then the number 2 rated was Cheers. Now, some of these others, Super Bowls are going to have surpassed. What's interesting is this was the finale to a very popular show. This was the finale to a very popular show, and so were these here. But over here, the 105.9 million viewers, for more than 2 decades, no show ever had more viewers than MASH did until the Super Bowl surpassed that a few years ago. They don't have anywhere near the rating, but there's just more people today, so each rating point equals more people. Now, what are some of the other things that are out there? And this one will be a good transition to get us into cable. How about the money that comes from satellite TV and direct TV and Sunday Ticket? That's where, if you have direct TV, you can have access to all of the football games. Well, DirecTV's first contract is just about to come up, and they had to negotiate for a new contract. Some thought perhaps DirecTV would not renew it because of the cost, because it was expensive. $1.5 billion per year. So DirecTV is paying the NFL $1.5 billion per year, and this is an 8-year contract. So you are committing a lot of money for a long time. Of course, why is DirecTV doing this? Because they believe that enough people who want to watch the NFL will be willing to switch to DirecTV, subscribe year-round, pay for the Sunday Ticket, and it's enough of a moneymaker for DirecTV to keep. Is it working or not? Depends what numbers you look at. Now, as you look at some of the jobs that there are available in TV and sports TV, well, of course, one area is the area of journalism and going out and getting sports stories and covering games and things like that. Do know that this is very competitive for the jobs. We've talked about just any kind of sports job tends to be competitive, but there's also competition for breaking the stories. Think of all the stories we've had lately, from the NFL to Florida State to all of those. Lots and lots of stories out there. You want to be the first, so there's competition to be the first to break a story. There's time pressures. TV works on usually very definitive schedules. If you are scheduled to do a story and you're in the Indianapolis market about the football game on Sunday night and it doesn't get over until 11, well, your sportscast begins at 11:20. You're going to have to turn that story around, ready to go and do your stand-up by then. You got to work under a lot of pressure. And then, of course, sometimes you've got to go dig for unpleasant stories. Most of us think about the fun of covering the sporting events, going to the games, watching the action, talking to the athletes afterwards. But sometimes you got to go in and break some stories, or, unpleasant stories are presented. Hence the NFL and domestic violence, and all of a sudden you get away from the game itself and you have to go cover some other things. There are many careers that you can go after on the TV side. There's TV anchoring. This could be both for SportsCenter, or this could be at Channel 14 and you're the sports anchor there. Or Rich Nye, who usually doesn't sports anchor up in Indianapolis, usually a reporter, but sometimes he'll step in and be an anchor. There's the play-by-play. Calling the games for TV, be it ESPN, Fox, NBC, CBS. And then, of course, here at USI, we're doing video streaming of pretty much every sport, and there's play-by-play opportunities, which I've talked about. They're still looking for people to do some of these things. I really encourage you to look into that further. Then there's a whole bunch of positions and careers that are behind the scenes, people that you really never see. I'll show you a video next week of what some of these positions are. But how about the camera operators out at the field? What about the video truck where everything goes and switches are made between this camera and that camera? How about directing? You're the one saying, hey, let's go to this camera. Let's stand by with the replay. Go replay. What about the producer who oversees it and makes sure things are running smoothly? A lot of sports communication careers through TV. Now we're going to look specifically at cable TV, and it goes along with the last aspect of TV we were talking about, but specifically cable. And cable has had an incredible impact on sports, just like TV in general has. And it's had many types of impacts. One, we've seen more local networks and regional networks. Some of the most famous ones are best known: Fox Sports Midwest, Fox Sports South, Fox Sports Southwest, and then there's even some others that aren't related to Fox. North Carolina has some, and all of those networks need sports. creating a demand for more sporting events, and then, of course, driving up the contract for carrying sports. 60% of all Americans have cable, and when we talk about cable, I'm talking about the cable literally runs from the utility pole to your house or apartment and then is fed through the house in cable. Now, there's more ways to get cable programming than just traditional cable. Of course, there's satellite. Now, disregard the dollar sign. That shouldn't be a dollar sign. This should be 27%. So 27% of Americans have satellite. So that means between the two, between cable and satellite, 87% of Americans bring in outside signals from what we would usually just call cable. But so cable TV, a lot of it is fed through sports, and that's created a great demand. Right now, ESPN is in 99 million homes, and cable is in about 99 million homes, actually just a little bit over that. What we're going to look at here is the latest ratings when it comes to cable viewership. And I have to wait for this to go along. But usually, sports on cable is either the highest rated show for a week or one of the highest rated. And usually it's the highest rated. Now, what we're looking at here is for the week that ended October 12th. And the highest rated show this week was Walking Dead, and it's just having unprecedented success when it comes to cable TV. And the audience here was 17 million. You'd add the 3 zeros down here, but 17 million. The number 2 rated show with audience was NFL, and it was on ESPN on Monday Night Football. Then look at the other sporting events that were among the top. On TBS, the American League Championship Series, National League Championship Series on Fox Sports 1, college football, baseball playoffs, college football. Then just in general, Sports Center. On this night, it had an audience of 3.4 million viewers, and then sports and sports. So you can see that cable delivered and satellite delivered sports is incredibly important to the TV and sports landscape. Now, something that cable TV has done, as there have been all these regional networks, is many local professional sports teams, especially their TV contracts are now held by cable, like the Indiana Pacers. If you want to watch them, most of their games, they are on a Fox Sports or regional network. Then, of course, there's just the cable sports networks themselves, none bigger than ESPN, then Fox Sports, but there's other smaller ones. There's Versus. They're very much known for carrying the Tour de France, the golf channel, the tennis cable channel. So there's lots of very specific ones there also. Then what we have seen because of what cable TV has done is we expect access to sports 24/7, around the clock, any day of the week. If you want to know what's going on in the sports world, we really expect to be able to turn on the cable and see something. And it could be ESPN, it could be the Big Ten or SEC or PAC networks. Well, outside of the traditional ones we just looked at, there's also sports films and sports documentaries. Now, sports documentaries, a lot of those documentaries are going to end up airing on an ESPN, 30 on 30, or on Fox Sports and stuff. So there's a big business there. And then there's also sports films. Let's look at what some of the big sports movies right now coming out, on Friday. Is 23 Blast. It's a drama. It's PG-13. It's sports related. Well, what is it? It's a teenager growing up in a small town, Kentucky. He's a local hero on and off the field. In his prime, he's stricken with an infection and then goes, of course, through the trials and tribulations. So, there's a sports related film. Here's a documentary, a documentary about a no-hitter by a famous pitcher. 108 Stitches. It's a comedy. It has to do with baseball. When the Game Stands Tall. This is a PG movie. It's gotten some decent feedback. And it follows a legendary coach who took a team from being not very good to very good. Doesn't that sound like pretty much every sports story that there is out there? Then looking at the top grossing of all time. So what do you think is the number one top grossing sports film of all time? And it's pulled in a whole lot of money. Yep, here it is. The number one all-time sports grossing movie is The Blind Side, about Michael Orr. Brought in over time $255 million, and it wasn't a really big expensive film to produce. So The Blind Side, certainly the Rockies have done very well. Seabiscuit, very good movie. Rocky, Remember the Titans? That was not a very expensive movie. $1 Million Baby, 42, about Jackie Robinson. Then, Moneyball, The Rookie, Any Given Sunday, Coach Carter, and it just goes down, and you can see what a lot of the other things are that are down there. So the film industry in sports can also be very, very big. Well, as we get ready to wrap up this section and this chapter, and then we'll be moving into chapter 9, talking about the web, what are some of the changes that TV has brought to sports? And there really have been some very big changes because of the demands of TV. Sports has to respond to it because TV is paying for sports basically lately with multi-million and multi-billion dollar contracts. Number one, perhaps the biggest of all, is there's longer games than there's ever been before. How can there be longer games? Because college football is still 60 minutes. Yes, but think of all the TV timeouts there are in a college football game or a professional football game. And if you've ever gone to either one of those and they've televised the games, you'll really get a feel for how it interrupts the flow of the game. Timeouts used to be 1 minute long. Now they're usually 2.5 minutes long so that the TV or cable network can get in their 2 minutes of commercials and then come back, set up the play, and then play resumes. Sometimes look at the field. Sometimes you'll see it on TV. If you're in person, you'll see, especially in football, a person who will be out on the field, not in uniform, usually have their hands out to the side, sometimes have bright colored gloves or mittens on. They're actually hooked up to the TV side, and until TV tells that person we can resume the game, the referees can't start the game because we have to wait for TV to return. So sometimes if you're at a game going, come on, everybody's ready, let's hike the ball, look over there. The person just a few yards out on the field is the one who's saying yay or nay. There's also more playoff teams and some more games than there used to be. And by games, I mean number of games played in a season. There's more Major League Baseball playoff teams today. There's more pro football teams today. Why are there more playoff teams that make the playoffs? Because TV needed it to make up for the money they were spending on the huge contracts. They needed more games to be able to sell more commercials. The NFL has been trying to appease the TV networks and go to an 18-game regular season NFL schedule so that there'd be more games to broadcast. So far, the NFL has said no. And because of TV, starting times are very different. Right now, with the World Series, the starting times are kind of strange. The game's going to start at 7 o'clock our time, actually about 7:25 with all the pregame. Then that means it's 8:25 on the East Coast, but that means it's 5:25 on the West Coast. So TV's tried to make it so that it's more national, where if it was on the East Coast, they'd rather just start the game at 7 so it gets over at a decent time. Then let's take the Southeastern Conference football. If you look at a schedule for any team at the start of the year, there's no starting times listed for any of the ball games because it's decided week by television what time the starting times are going to be, because the best game of the week is going to go to CBS. It's going to start at 3, but we won't know that until a week or two out. Then the second best game is going to be on ESPN. Is that going to be an evening game or a noon game? And so starting times 100% dependent upon TV. We've also seen an increase in scoring, and how's that happen? Because of rules changes. Why did some of the rules change? Because people watching TV like more scoring, and so rules have changed, especially in the NFL, to protect the wide receiver, and you see lots of penalties there. That's one reason why soccer in America is still not incredibly dominant, because it's just not high scoring. And then, of course, the replays that we see, eventually the replays we saw on TV become part of the rules, and a play can be reviewed on replay, and if it's a bad call, the call can be overturned. All brought about by TV. Now, TV didn't necessarily demand it, but it was an impact brought about by TV. And then, of course, more money for athletes. If TV's spending billions of dollars on sports, those athletes are going to get a piece of some of that money, and so we start getting athletes making $10+ million a year. So let's wrap this up and talk about, if you want to get into this business, and it's an incredibly exciting business to be a sports reporter or television reporter, what are some of the things that you need to look at? Number one, take all the classes you can in sport, which is what you're doing with your sports management major. Take classes in writing, both broadcast style of writing and print writing. Get into reporting. Take broadcast journalism. Take print journalism. All of those things are going to help you. Get an internship, just like we've talked about numerous times. Get an internship. You're going to gain practical experience, and you're going to network. Be persistent and curious. If you're not persistent, if you're not willing to fight for the story, you're going to fail. If you're not curious and wondering about, man, I wonder if there's a story here, you're never going to be the one that breaks a story, that stands out from the pack. Don't be afraid to ask for help. This is both, hey, I know you know this person, I'd like to interview them. Can you help me get an interview with them? Or, you know what, man, I saw you do something the other day on your network that was really cool. How'd you do that? And any kind of help. People are there. You get better by asking for help. Be willing to go to great lengths for a story. Not all stories drop in your lap. Usually the stories that drop in your lap are going to be okay stories, but it's the ones that are great stories that you have to work for. Learn how to ask good questions. And good questions for a sports reporter is not going to be one that you can answer with a yes or no. It's an open-ended question. And then you also need to understand enough about the game and the individual to be able to ask quality questions. Develop a network of sources. Meet people, make sure they know who you are on the team, with administration on the, in the athletic office or ownership. Get to know a lot of people. They're going to be able to open some stories for you because they know people that can help you. If you want to get into this, take voice lessons. In radio TV, we have radio TV performance that will do some of this, but the theater department offers every now and then a class called Voice and Diction. Outstanding class, and it will help you greatly. Always seek self-improvement. Don't settle for where you're at. Even the best of the professionals on ABC, NBC, ESPN, they still get critiqued. They're still improving. They're never to that point where they can just go, well, I've gotten as good as I can get and I'll stay there forever. Always need to be improving. Don't be shy about delving into social issues, even though you're a sports reporter, or politics, as long as it's connected. Boy, think Muhammad Ali there, and other provocative topics, social issues, domestic violence, the NFL. Unfortunately, those two came together. Be willing to work all the time. Again, like almost every sports job, it's not a 9-to-5 job. It's usually evenings, but if you're going to go and get some great stories, you're going to have to put in a lot of time. Try to find the things that no one else knows. Wow, that person on the team did this and this to get here. What an incredibly great human interest story. I'm going to tell that story that somebody else isn't. Remember that key quotes can often come as someone's walking away. Why is that listed in here? If an athlete's walking away, but they're still kind of talking to you, keep that microphone and camera right up there. Walk with them. Sometimes the best quotes come from there. Check out any Steve Spurrier quote at halftime with the reporter on the sidelines. A lot of times he's walking and giving those quotes. It's great stuff. Sometimes you just need to go with your gut instinct on stories. but you learn gut instinct by getting experience. So you want to continue to get experience, and then that will tend to come. Learn to build drama with your words. Learn to build drama with the visuals. Now, that doesn't mean make up stuff, but learn to be a great storyteller. And then do everything you can and learn everything you can to maximize your marketability. You want to be as marketable as you can so more people will watch you and see you. And then, of course, perhaps you want to move up in the market to get to larger markets, make more money. You get there by making sure that you can maximize who you are and how you are seen by others. Well, that's it for this chapter, so we'll be moving to chapter 9. The rest of this class period until 2:45, you need to get with your groups on your major project and work with those. Do work through the end of class period. Thanks, guys, and we will see you on Tuesday.